of blocking the head. So it's pretty much just getting a start on this. But the first part I just want to talk about with Bobby is growing up in Staten Island, probably around the same age. I'm 43. I don't know if we're close in age.
Yeah.
But just like growing up in the 80s and 90s and how
Yeah.
Staten Island was, and trying to like. Especially the North Shore, because I'm from the Mid-Island South Shore.
Yeah.
We used to call it the expressway to Mason-Dixon line.
Yeah.
Very different in the South Shore back in the 80s and 90s, if you remember.
I remember. Very different. Very different. It's interesting that you use that analogy, Mason-Dixon line. That's really interesting. Yeah, we're trying to blur the lines, right?
Yeah. So just give me what was it like growing up?
Yeah, I mean, for me, so I was born in Brooklyn, and to West African immigrants from Nigeria, and being born in Brooklyn and then we moved to Staten Island. I would say mid-70s, and all we knew. I mean, we moved to Park Hill, right? So all we knew was Park Hill. And there were probably a handful of, I would say, West African immigrants at that time. Probably about 10 families, maybe. And it was, I being born in America, but to West African immigrants, like I had the best of both worlds, right? And we grew up, with African American kids. And going to school, look up to you, right? Because now you're making me go deep, right? I'm going to, I don't get to talk about this a lot. So, growing up in Park Hill was, there was a sense of family there. Like everyone knew everyone pretty much. But at the same time, and I probably didn't even really know that then, I know it now, that we lacked many things. For instance, we didn't have a soccer field. We didn't have, we had a basketball court that was like, at one of the local schools, 57. But, we made do with what we had. As I say, like now, as a grown-up, I know what we didn't have. We had the local delis, around the bodegas. And it was, they say it was tough. It was tough growing up because my parents worked a lot, and being the eldest son, the responsibility fell on my shoulders.
What'd your parents do?
Well, my dad at the time was working in traffic, was working as traffic division. My stepmom was a nurse, and my mom was overseas. So I was responsible for 3 siblings, and that meant coming back home from school, making sure they ate, making sure that their homework was done, and just generally like my sister, I was responsible for my younger sister and making sure that she was cared for. And then, you had a limit to how much fun you could have in that stead, because the time that you want to, because you think about getting home from school, you just want to do your homework, go out and play and have fun, right? So that wasn't the same for me, but that's not a bad thing. I think that has given me a sense of maturity and a sense of responsibility. It matured me relatively quickly. But growing up and interacting with other kids is much different today. Like, we weren't into the gun culture as much. I mean, there was gun violence, but I recall, if you had issues, you settled it with the hands, which happened often, like, I guess, personalities, and the sense that the neighborhood was but a radius, and not many of us traveled outside of that radius, right?
So you were just in your area, really?
Yeah, like you were like, look, I lived in 225 Park Hill, right? And there's 225, and then you have the buildings that go to 180 and 55 Bowman. You're talking about, 6 or 7 buildings, 8 buildings. Don't quote me me on that. And it was almost like everybody was on top of each other because these are housings, right? These are high-rise apartment buildings. And it's like, who's the baddest kid in the community? Who's the toughest? You know, that was what it was all.
But it was about fists back then.
It was about fists, you know, like, and that's what I loved about growing up in the 80s, that if you had an issue with somebody, it wasn't that, yeah, I'm picking up a gun and, you know, I mean, again, there was gun violence, but, you know, yeah. And, you know, in Park Hill, I was pretty tough growing up, you know, like, I was one of those guys who, because, you know, I was the son of immigrants, I knew what it was like to be bullied and, you know, to be looked at as different. So I developed
Even in your own community?
Even in my own community, because look, my parents were from West Africa, so you had African American kids would make fun of you and say, "Hey, where are you guys from? You in Africa? You guys still live on trees, or you know, stuff like that, you know?" Or they have these names, African booty snatchers,
Yeah, well, Jewish,
you know.
I was the only Jewish
So you get it. So you got it. So you know what I'm talking about. But you know, like once you got to know each other, like that didn't really matter. Like I have friends, you know, African American friends. I had African friends. I remember, you know, Yugoslavia. You know, there's a lot of people from Yugoslavia that went to my school, and we 57. So I went to 57, then I went to IS 49. You know, so 57 is in the heart of Park Hill, and IS 49 is in Stapleton. So, I mean, you know, again, we didn't have a rich upbringing. When I say rich, meaning that we didn't get to go to Florida on vacation, Disney World. There was no Disney. There was none of that stuff. I mean, the most you got, you went to Manhattan on a boat. You know what I'm saying? And like that was like, wow, we're in the city. This is great. You know, and you know, the community, the world felt smaller in that sense, right? Because you go to sleep and you wake up and it's the same people, it's the same deli owners, it's the same bodega, you know, and it's the same routine.
Do you think the internet changed a lot of?
Oh man,
everything making it seem smaller instead of so large now. The world is open to kids now, like through the internet.
Well, I think the internet does make the world bigger, but as and I'll get to that story, but as someone who later was able to travel, once I was able to go outside of America, I mean, it opened up my mind in ways that I can't even explain to you. It just, once I got a taste of what it was like to travel outside of this country, I mean, I'm an avid traveler. And believe me, if I don't get to travel in the month, if I don't get to fly out in the month, I'm like, yeah, that's like my high.
So you travel like monthly? You try to at least?
Yeah, I haven't flown out in the past couple of months because of my knee injury, and because when you get on the plane, the gravity, the altitude, and whatever, like really messes with, you know. So, and I've been very, very busy with opening up Canvas, you know, and just different projects that I've been working on. But I want to go back to like growing up in Park Hill. You think, yeah, you think in terms of, and I talk about, there's so many things growing up. You know, there was if you were into hip hop, you know, where were you going with it? You know, Wu-Tang Clan comes to mind, right?
Yeah.
And
Staten Island
Staten Island is known for the Wu-Tang, yeah. And they came from Park Hill. The majority of the members are right from Park Hill, from the neighborhood I grew up in. I lived on the third floor, 225, and Raekwon lived on the second floor. You know, Kappa lived on the building across from me. And, you know, a sense of just really looking for an outlet, different outlets, because if you were on the streets, you were either doing two things. You were either selling drugs, or you were looking for an opportunity to just have a little bit of fun. If it was, you know, at the arcade on Taji Street, or playing basketball, you know, at 55, I mean at 57 rather. But there was not more than that. You know, we didn't have like a Cromwell in our neighborhood. We didn't have a community center per se. we had the rec centers that were like at the basement of each building. But again, it was limited to just that. There wasn't a whole lot of resource. I use that word now, resource. Meaning options. There weren't a whole lot of options. You didn't have an opportunity to go to like an Owl Hollow or South Beach. I remember going to South Beach at one point with some friends, and we got chased. We got chased out of, we were walking down, I think it might have been Father Capadonna, and we got chased all the way back to about Bay Street, just for being in the wrong neighborhood. And, as far as then, I would say the neighborhood, between the black, whites, and whatnots, that was a huge thing. I mean, it's still prevalent now, right? But then as kids, we always, we knew why we weren't welcome to some neighborhoods, but at the same time, as a kid, you grow up questioning that, until I guess you get into your adult and realize what things are. But nevertheless, we always made do with what we had, and we appreciated the space that we did have. We given a couple of knuckleheads here and there, but for the most part, everyone got along, and you knew the lay of the land. Like if you acted up, for whatever reasons, situations were always able to be addressed. However, and then later on, I went to 49. When I was in 49, we winded up moving to Stapleton. Right behind Broad Street was where we lived. I lived with my aunt over there, and it was mainly it's different neighborhood. So you have Parkview, you have Stapleton, different neighborhood, but again the same lack of options. You know what I mean? Like you come back from school, you go home, you do your homework, or play video games. ColecoVision, remember that? Atari, remember that? And the games were like super basic.
We love those games.
Oh man, remember Centipede?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, that was, Pac-Man. But things were much more simpler, and I guess again because we were younger, and it was the 80s. But I'll never forget some of like the challenges, because the challenges are what shape you in life. Really, walking into streets where you would see, people shooting up, using drugs, and really struggling to understand what that world was all about. But you just knew that was no good, because you could see the way the people who were using the drugs, how they're depreciated, in weight, in appearance, and otherwise. And then there are people that we knew that fell to that. The crack epidemic was something, man. It was something, and I think that really it's interesting, because if you think about Staten Island right now, for me, somebody who grew up in that era of the AIDS epidemic, crack epidemic, gun violence, that I don't know if it was. I don't have the stats, but I don't know if it was as bad as it is now. But I know there was a whole era in the 80s where.
I think it's worse now.
I think right now.
The heroin going on now.
So the heroin epidemic, the opiate epidemic, reminds me of the crack era. The only difference is that back then, I think, especially in the black community, there was no help. There was no therapy being offered. The government was not trying. The government was not trying to treat it as it was an illness. People were being thrown in jail. Families were being ripped apart. help was not being offered. Now, with the opiate epidemic, there is help being offered. It's being looked at like an illness, and they're throwing resources and programs. They're setting up programs to sort of slow down the epidemic. And that makes me think. That makes me think that what was the impact of the approach that the government took back then on the families that were inflicted with that epidemic, by that epidemic, and how has that shaped the community now? As someone who does community development work, I mean, I see it. I see it in how depressed some of the underserved and inner communities are. And I hate that terminology, underserved, by the way. Yeah. I think it's a broad brush. I think it's a labeling, and it's hard for you not to wonder that, or rather believe that it's not all strategic.
Do you think there's any tension behind it?
Look, if we want to resolve an issue, being a great nation that we are, we can do so. All right. What's the difference between? I'll ask you. What's the difference between what happened in the '80s with the crack era, and now what's happening with the opioid epidemic? Can you tell me the difference?
I think you're seeing it more on the South Shore and in whiter communities versus the Black community.
So it's hard to argue that isn't a factor, right? And I think that those types of situations, they give birth to many issues, a myriad of issues when you think in terms of like gun violence, right? Like for me, like somebody that grew up in the hood, I knew when they were carrying AK-47 and Uzis around in Park Hill, for real. And, the police couldn't even come in those neighborhoods. And I mean, it was like living in a concrete jungle, like you really had to know which streets you were walking on and who you were messing with and who, it's not like today where the kids are like really disrespectful, you don't really know who you're dealing with. Everybody's carrying a gun. I mean, let me not say everybody's carrying a gun, but kids have easy access to guns right now. So
you don't think it was easier back then?
I mean, it was easy, but I think it's a lot more accessible because when you think about the '80s, those who were handling the guns, they were not necessarily that young. These are guys that were in their 20s and above, who were either connected to like the drug trade, or who were sort of connected to the gun running. Right now, like, I mean, a 15-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 6-year-old's got access to a gun. I mean, if you look at most of the kids doing the shooting, these kids are under 20. I mean, the thing is that there's easy access to guns, especially right now. And you look in terms of different states or different places. I want to stick to Staten Island, but just use Chicago as an instance. I mean, I'm baffled at how we cannot put a stop to that. And oftentimes they say, well, it's the community has to stop. The question is, we got to look at where are these guns coming from. The same way with like the opiate issue, right? Where these drugs come, who's supplying these drugs, who is supplying the drugs, and how are the drugs flowing to the point where everybody's has access to it. We have we're a powerful government that has resources. And resources should be deployed where they're most needed.
Why don't you think, I mean, like nowadays with, so many people having access to guns, why don't you think like local government doesn't like step in more? I'm not even talking about like, because we know federal, they're not really doing anything. More like on the local level.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, you can't really say that they're not stepping in. You know, this is a quagmire of a situation. Look, in the underserved community, in the I hate the word minority also, but in the inner city, in the black, hate that word too. All these terminologies are antiquated, you know, but I mean they're constantly being, you know, utilized, and I don't want to repeat that. But in the black communities, there are different things that are happening. All right, you have lack of jobs, lack of employment. You have housing issues, serious housing issues. You have educational issues. You know, maybe your parents didn't have formal education, um, and aren't able to participate in your education, right? So that what happens is you pretty much are having like a generational challenge, right? And it's not making excuses or anything. That's factually what's happening in these communities, all right? So now what happens is you have parents who work around the clock, for instance, trying to make ends meet, and it's not happening. So the kid is being neglected, and that child is either going to be raised by the streets, or essentially they're raising themselves.
Do you think there's more opportunity now for like after school programs and kids to get into more programs than back when you grew up?
Definitely. This is partially, this is mainly, not even partially, this is mainly why Canvas Institute is important. This is why I'm putting my money, time, energy, and sweat into this, because, you know, let me get a little bit political. So Cromwell used to service like hundreds of people, right? That sank. What replaced Cromwell? Okay. So now we have a Gerard Carter Center that the JCC runs, and I've been talking to David about this. And the operational hours don't fit what the community needs and requires.
So what's the operational hours now?
Right now, because the Cornerstone program is only funded, like the whole center isn't funded.
Right.
They funded a partial activities at the center, and I don't know the exact hours, but I do know that they can't give the community 24 access, and I know that there's restrictions to, and not necessarily by JCC, but because of the funding, the way the city funded them, they can only operate a certain hours, because you have to have security there, you have to have staff there, and they can't pay them beyond that. And I wondered to myself, when I heard this, I wondered, like, how does that make any sense? If it took 10 years to build the space, give the community 24 access. Because this is how I see it, and this is the facts. If kids have a place to go to engage in a safe space where they're not threatened, they'll be there. If they're not home, they'll be there. They'd rather be there than the streets. The kids are in the streets because, you know what, either they don't feel safe at any of these centers, or there's not available programming there, or oftentimes the centers, there's lack of funding that's going on there also. Like those who are running the programs are basically scraping the bottom of the pot to make ends meet. And I know this for a fact because I speak to a lot of program coordinators. And in the way that the funding is made available, you got to jump through hoops to get some of this funding. And then when you get the funding, they restrict you in ways that it doesn't allow for you to maximize to the potential of where it translates to benefiting the population, right? So back to the original question you asked me. When you have all of these mixtures, what happens is now gangs come in because kids are getting bullied. Yeah, infiltrate. Gangs, they've always been gangs, but gangs are now, they have a foundation to get a foothold. So gangs are available. The kids are, if a kid's being bullied and he gets initiated into a gang, that now becomes his family. And that his original issue was he was getting bullied. And
is there, like, I know in the 80s there was more gangs. Is there more, like, do you see more gangs now than when you were growing up? Or?
I mean, locally, I think the situation with the gangs has gotten a little better. For Staten Island speaking, I'm not talking about Brooklyn or any other borough. For Staten Island, it's gotten a little bit better. But I remember about 10 years ago when the Bloods and Crips were like rising. You know, they were really getting stronger. And I know a couple of people who were victim to slashing and stabbing and whatnot. I think that there has to be. So to answer your question, do I feel that there's more gangs? At this particular moment, I don't think that's the main issue right now. There are gangs, but it isn't as if it's more severe than the gun violence situation, even though they sort of go hand in hand, because the guys doing the shooting most likely are from a gang or are involved in drug dealing or are victims of someone who, or domestic violence now is one of the reasons that their gun violence is at such a rate that it's at right now. But the reality of the matter is that all of these issues unchecked, resources not provided to either organizations or institutions or even the police to resolve and track and keep and stay on top of these issues, then you're going to continue to have a perpetuation of this issue in the community. And when the community is dealing with this, they're dealing with this fear. There's victimization that's going on, because if someone has been gunned down, you can expect retaliation from the family, right? You can expect that the young people that are seeing and hearing about this and dealing with this are dealing with trauma that goes untreated, trauma that goes undiagnosed, so all of this is now in one radius. So you're dealing with mental health, you're dealing with cultural issues, you're dealing with economic issues, and it's just layers on layers on layers on layers on layers. So families are dealing with that, the kids are dealing with it, and then let's not even get into the whole education aspect of it, right?
So before we just take a break here, so public school back then in the 80s, how is it? I mean, your sons grew up in the public school system too. Yeah. Do you see a big difference from when you were younger?
Look, so I grew up in Park Hill, Stapleton, right? I can't tell you. There's been some difference, but what I've noticed, because my kids went to school in Mid-Island. What I could tell you right away is this: the schools that my kids went to and the schools that I work in and speak at, huge difference. Huge difference in terms of resources. I'll give you a quick scenario. When about 5 years ago at PS57, there wasn't an arts program, right? You would expect there's arts program in every school, right? You would assume that, yeah. You would assume that this is America. We have great school, we got great pro, but they didn't have, because they couldn't pay for an arts teacher. Then they had supplies, and then there was like a restriction to, if you don't have an art teacher, you basically can't. Right. Now you can't use the supplies. So you got stuff that's the same with the music department. So with the music department, they had the instruments but no instructor.
So the instruments would sit there and
rusting and going to waste, right? So these are and this is common sense. You would think it's common sense. Well, we have equipment here. Let's get funding. The DOE. There should be I feel that there should be a requirement. Music and arts must be in school.
Well, I was an art teacher for like 5 years. Every school I actually taught in Bed-Stuy, and there was no supplies.
And isn't that mind blowing?
And I taught in Williamsburg too, and even there, they would give us a budget for art supplies, but it's very limited. And then little by little, over the 5 years, you would see just arts totally disappear.
Yep, I saw that happen many times. And so it goes. So when you ask me in terms of do I see an improvement in public school, it's shameful that we can continue to say we're the greatest country in the world. Corporate good, right. Corporate responsibility to offer supplies to these communities that are underserved. How hard is that? Right. You know, you want to tell us like states can't give tax breaks to, you know, a Crayola, for instance, will donate, or, you know, Sam Ash, for instance, right? And they're depriving these children of an outlet. They're depriving these children of creative outlets where if they're facing hardship at home, they get an opportunity to go to school and experience something that's rich, that's fuller. You know what I mean? Like, so that contributes to some of the complexities that the kids deal with.
Do you think a lot of it is because of testing now? Like everything's focused on testing and,
I mean,
and school scores and things like that?
It's testing and school scores is what was our focus. You know, at one point we were high ranking in terms of, you know, our education, right? Where do we rank today?
Right.
You know, where do we rank really? What kind of education, what value in education are our children receiving, right? When you think in terms of like, let's just say for instance, like a 12-year-old. 12-year-olds growing up in the 80s,
Right.
and then a 12-year-old growing up now, you can, you know, like I talk to my sons a lot, you can compare and contrast and see what is their ability to comprehend, what's their ability to carry out simple tasks. You know what I'm saying? Like, or to just build. I remember back then we had electric class, we had carpentry.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean?
Shop
Like
class.
shop class. And you took those skills and you were really able as an adult, even if you didn't go to college, to apply yourself, right? Now, I mean, like, you got graduates who can't do the most basic things. I mean,
I
and
think with
it's,
technology taking over a lot of jobs, you know, tech, there needs to be a lot more of that in schools too.
I agree.
But,
I agree.
Just to give you a few minutes break,
Yeah.
let you stretch, come back in a few minutes. We'll
Cool.
do 2 more sessions.
Cool,
And then
cool. Yeah,
I know you're busy. I want to be respectful.
Yeah, we gotta
of
get
your time.
started. Yeah, appreciate it.
Okay, cool.
All right, thanks.
Charcoal.
Charcoal? That's
All right,
fine.
guys, let's just take a 5-minute break, let me stretch your legs. So I hope you learned something. Let's start with a match.
That's interesting. Wow, that's not bad.